Opening scene. The grand courtroom was filled with the usual buzz of anticipation. Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General, sat confidently at the defendant's table. She was poised, her hands clasped together, and around her neck hung a small but unmistakable gold cross. On the judge's bench sat Judge Malcolm Reeves, a man known for his strict, no-nonsense demeanor. He had a reputation for controlling his courtroom with an iron grip, often pushing the boundaries of judicial authority. "Ms. Bondi," Judge Reeves began, adjusting his glasses, "before we proceed with this case, I need to address a pressing matter." Pam raised her eyebrows slightly but remained silent. "The cross," he continued, nodding toward her necklace. "This is a government building, and I do not permit religious displays of any kind in my courtroom." A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. Pam instinctively touched the delicate cross resting just above her heart. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "this is a personal religious symbol. It does not interfere with these proceedings." Judge Reeves leaned forward. "It does interfere. This courtroom is a place of law, not personal beliefs. I am issuing a fine of $5,000 for violating court decorum." A collective gasp filled the room. Even the opposing counsel seemed surprised. Pam let out a slow breath, her expression unreadable. She had spent her entire career defending justice, and now she was being penalized for something as fundamental as her faith. "Understood, Your Honor," she finally said, but there was something in her tone, a quiet defiance that didn't go unnoticed. As the trial proceeded, Pam's mind remained sharp. She listened carefully, analyzed every word, and noted every inconsistency. She was a seasoned litigator, and she wasn't about to let an unfair ruling distract her from her purpose. By the time closing arguments approached, it was clear that Pam had outmaneuvered the prosecution. She had dismantled their case with precision, exposing weak arguments and contradictions. Even the jury seemed to lean in her favor. Judge Reeves, however, was clearly unimpressed. He drummed his fingers against the bench, his gaze narrowing at Pam as though looking for a way to regain control. "Before we conclude," he said suddenly, "I would like to revisit the matter of Ms. Bondi's cross." Pam met his gaze steadily. "As I stated earlier," he continued, "this court does not allow religious displays. In addition to the fine, I am ordering a contempt hearing to discuss whether further disciplinary action is warranted." The courtroom erupted in whispers. This was unprecedented. Finding an attorney was one thing. Holding a contempt hearing over a piece of jewelry was something else entirely. Pam stood slowly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I must challenge your ruling." "Judge." Reeves raised an eyebrow. "Oh, on what grounds?" She smiled faintly, tilting her head. "On legal grounds, Your Honor. You see, this isn't just about a cross. This is about First Amendment rights, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and quite frankly, judicial overreach." The murmur in the courtroom grew louder. "Judge," Reeves's face darkened. "You are dangerously close to being in contempt, Ms. Bondi," he warned. Pam took a step forward. "And you, Your Honor, are dangerously close to violating constitutional law." A stunned silence filled the room. "You may not agree with my faith," she continued, "but you cannot fine me for wearing a religious symbol in a public courtroom. The Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld that religious expression, especially in personal attire, is protected under the First Amendment." Judge Reeves shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "In Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District," Pam continued, "the court ruled that individual expression cannot be stifled unless it disrupts proceedings. Has my cross disrupted these proceedings, Your Honor? Or is it simply something you personally dislike?" The judge clenched his jaw. "And let's not forget West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett," she added. "The government cannot force individuals to surrender their beliefs simply to participate in public life. That applies in schoolrooms, public offices, and yes, courtrooms. The tension in the room was thick. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Pam took a deep breath. Your Honor, your personal biases do not override constitutional rights. And if you insist on this fine, you will have to justify it against decades of Supreme Court precedent. Judge Reeves exhaled sharply. His authority had never been so publicly challenged. He glanced at the prosecution, as if expecting them to jump in, but they remained silent. Finally, he looked back at Pam. His lips pressed into a thin line. The fine is withdrawn, he muttered, barely audible. Pam raised an eyebrow. Pardon, Your Honor? Judge Reeves inhaled deeply. The fine is withdrawn, he said louder, his voice clipped. And there will be no contempt hearing. A wave of astonishment swept through the courtroom. Pam Bondi had not only stood her ground, she had forced a federal judge to reverse his own ruling. She nodded once, then took her seat, her cross still gleaming under the courtroom lights. And just like that, the battle was won. Not with anger, not with defiance, but with sheer legal brilliance. The courtroom remained silent for a long moment. No one dared to speak, as if breaking the hush would somehow undo what had just happened. Even the bailiff, a man who had seen countless legal battles unfold in this very room, seemed frozen in place. Pam Bondi sat back in her chair, her posture as composed as ever. But there was a subtle glint in her eyes, a quiet triumph. She hadn't just defended herself. She had exposed a judge's overreach in a way that left no room for retaliation. Judge Reeves shifted in his chair, adjusting his robe as if trying to regain a sense of control. He cleared his throat. Let's move on, he muttered, though. His usual authoritative tone was noticeably subdued. The case resumed, but the energy in the room had changed. Everyone, jurors, attorneys, spectators, had just witnessed something extraordinary. Pam Bondi had turned a moment of unjust reprimand into a masterclass in constitutional law. But she wasn't finished yet. As the proceedings continued, Pam remained razor-sharp. She dissected witness testimonies with precision, countered the prosecution's arguments effortlessly, and laid out her case with the confidence of someone who had spent years mastering her craft. By the time she gave her closing argument, there was little doubt in anyone's mind about the outcome. She had built an airtight case, leaving the opposition scrambling to regain their footing. When the jury finally returned with a verdict, it was exactly as Pam had anticipated. Not guilty. The words rang through the courtroom, solidifying what many had already suspected. Pam Bondi had won, and she had done so decisively. There was a brief moment of silence before the murmur of voices filled the air. Spectators whispered to one another, some shaking their heads in amazement, others nodding as if they had expected nothing less. Pam gathered her files, calm as ever. But as she stood, she caught sight of Judge Reeves watching her. His expression was unreadable, part frustration, part reluctant admiration. She met his gaze evenly. Then, with a slight nod, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, her cross still resting against her chest. Outside, reporters swarmed her the moment she stepped into the sunlight. Microphones and cameras were thrust in her direction, journalists eager to get a statement. Ms. Bondi, what do you have to say about the judge's attempt to fine you for wearing a cross? Do you believe this was religious discrimination? Were you prepared to take this all the way to the Supreme Court? Pam raised a hand, signaling for silence. The crowd quieted. I have always believed in the rule of law, she said, her voice steady. And today, the law prevailed. The First Amendment is not up for debate. It protects all Americans, regardless of faith, background, or belief. The reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing as she continued. What happened today was not about me, she said. It was about ensuring that no American is forced to choose between their faith and their right to participate in public life. A reporter in the back called out, "Do you think Judge Reeves should face consequences?" Pam smiled faintly. I think today was consequence enough. The crowd erupted in questions, but Pam had said all she needed to say. She turned and walked toward her car, her cross gleaming in the sunlight. She had won the case. She had defended the Constitution. And most importantly, she had stood her ground, proving once again that true power lies not in intimidation, but in the unwavering strength of conviction. As Pam Bondi walked away from the courthouse, the air still buzzing with the weight of what had just happened, she felt a sense of satisfaction, not just from winning the case, but from standing firm when it mattered most. She reached her car, but before she could open the door, a voice called out behind her. Ms. Bondi, wait! She turned to see a young woman, no older than 25, pushing through the crowd of reporters. She had dark brown hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, her expression filled with emotion. Pam hesitated for a moment before stepping toward her. Yes? The young woman took a shaky breath. I just wanted to say thank you. Pam's brows furrowed. For what? The woman swallowed hard. For standing up for people like me. She reached up, pulling out a delicate chain. From under her blouse, a small silver cross dangled from it. I work for a government office, she explained. Last year, my supervisor told me I should consider removing this because it might make people uncomfortable. I didn't know my rights, so I took it off. Her voice wavered. I felt ashamed. Pam's expression softened. And now? The young woman exhaled, a tear slipping down her cheek. Now I know better. Now I know that I never have to apologize for my faith. Because of you. Pam reached out and gave the woman's hand a firm squeeze. You never did, she said, and you never will. The woman nodded, wiping her eyes. Thank you, she whispered again before stepping back into the crowd. Pam watched her go, a deep sense of purpose filling her chest. This wasn't just about one case, one fine, or one judge's overreach. It was about something far bigger, the message it sent to millions of people who felt pressured to hide their beliefs. She finally slid into her car, but before turning the key, she reached up and touched the cross around her own neck. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a statement, a reminder, a battle fought and won. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she knew that this was far from the last time she'd have to defend these rights. But that was fine. She was ready. And the next time someone tried to silence faith in the name of authority, whether in a courtroom, an office, or anywhere else, Pam Bondi would be there, armed with the law, the Constitution, and an unshakable conviction. Because today wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been told to hide what they believed. And she had just proven, once and for all, that they never had to. As Pam Bondi drove away from the courthouse, the weight of the day's events settled in. The legal victory was significant, but what mattered even more was the precedent it set. Somewhere out there, people were watching. People who had been silenced, pressured, or made to feel that their faith had no place in the public sphere, and now they knew better. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat. She glanced down at the screen during a red light. Her inbox was flooded with messages. Some from colleagues congratulating her, others from strangers thanking her for standing firm. One message stood out, though. It was from an old friend, a constitutional law professor she had studied with years ago. Pam, what you did today is going to have ripple effects. That judge won't be the last to try this. Be ready. They'll come for you next. Pam took a deep breath. She knew he was right. This case had exposed something deeper. A growing effort to push faith out of public spaces, to redefine the boundaries of what was acceptable under the law. She wasn't naive. She had spent her career battling forces that sought to manipulate the Constitution to fit their own agenda. But this was personal. Pulling into her driveway, she shut off the engine and sat in silence for a moment. Her cross still rested against her chest, a quiet reminder of everything she had fought for. She wasn't just a lawyer. She wasn't just a public figure. She was a defender of something much bigger than herself. She stepped out of the car, the cool evening air wrapping around her as she walked toward her front door. Before she could reach for her keys, another buzz from her phone made her pause. This time, it was a news alert. Breaking. Judge Malcolm Reeves faces ethics complaint over religious discrimination ruling. Pam's eyebrows lifted slightly. She hadn't filed any complaints. Someone else had. The legal system was already moving, reacting to what had happened in that courtroom. It was clear now that this wasn't just about one moment. It was part of a much bigger fight. And she was ready for it. Stepping inside, she placed her phone on the table and made her way to the bookshelf in her study. Her fingers traced the spines of her legal books until she found what she was looking for, her well-worn copy of the U.S. Constitution. She opened it, flipping through the familiar pages until she landed on the First Amendment. She had read it 1,000 times, but tonight it felt different, more powerful, more urgent. She whispered the words under her breath. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Pam smiled to herself. Let them try. Let them challenge what was right, because as long as she had breath in her body, she would be there to fight back. For the law, for justice, for the simple, undeniable truth that no one, no judge, no politician, no institution had the right to tell Americans they couldn't live their faith openly. And the next time someone tried, Pam Bondi would be waiting. The night stretched on, but Pam Bondi couldn't sleep. The courtroom battle still echoed in her mind. The tension, the arguments, the moment when Judge Reeves realized he had overstepped. She had faced countless legal fights in her career, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about law, it was about something fundamental, something that touched the core of what it meant to be free in America. She made her way to the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee despite the late hour. The glow of her phone screen illuminated the darkened room as she scrolled through messages. One in particular caught her attention. It was from an unknown number, but the words sent a chill through her spine. Back down, or we'll make sure this was just the beginning. Pam stared at the message for a long moment before locking her phone and setting it down on the counter. Threats weren't new to her. She had faced them before, from corrupt politicians, from criminals, from those who didn't want to see justice served. But this was different. Someone was watching. Someone was angry. She took a slow sip of coffee, her mind already working through the possibilities. Whoever had sent that message wanted her to feel intimidated. They wanted her to retreat, to let this case be nothing more than a momentary controversy that would fade into the background. They didn't know who they were dealing with. The next morning, Pam arrived at her office earlier than usual. A stack of legal briefs sat on her desk, but she barely glanced at them. Instead, she pulled out a fresh notepad and began outlining her next steps. The fight wasn't over. If Judge Reeves had been willing to violate the First Amendment so brazenly, how many others were doing the same? How many Americans had been silenced, fined, or threatened simply for living their faith? Pam picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. Pam? It's been a while? It has, she agreed, but I need your help. The man on the other end of the line didn't hesitate. I saw the case. What are you thinking? Pam leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing in determination. I'm thinking this isn't just about one courtroom, it's about a pattern, and I intend to expose it. A pause, then a low chuckle. You're talking about taking this national, aren't you? Pam smiled. Why stop at one fight when there are a dozen others waiting to be won? She could hear the approval in his voice. Then let's make some waves. Hanging up, Pam knew she had just set something in motion, something bigger than herself. She wasn't just going to defend the Constitution in court. She was going to take this battle to the public, to the media, to every corner of the country. where people were being told they had to check their faith at the door. The message was clear. They wanted her to back down.